Today we'll be learning about position, distance, and displacement. So first up, we need to look at each of these terms. Position, the variable in physics for position is x. This gets a little confusing because also you're probably used to using x for every unknown in math class. In physics, x is reserved for position. So make sure you are using that just for position. The SI units, or the standard units for position, are meters, and we abbreviate that just with a lowercase m. And the definition of position is just a single location or address of an object. You should be pretty familiar with what position is already, but there's the official definition. Distance, it gets the variable d. Its units are also meters, and its definition is the total amount traveled. We'll see an example of that in a second. Displacement, it gets the variable delta, that's what that triangle is, so delta x. Units, also meters, and its definition is the final position compared to the initial position, otherwise known as just the change in position of an object. So here we can look at an example, looking at the state of Wisconsin. In the first column here, we're going from Milwaukee to Port Washington and then Port Washington to Green Bay. So the distance of that trip is Milwaukee to Port Washington, 25 miles, Port Washington to Green Bay, 75 miles. So in total, the distance is just 100 miles. If we look at displacement instead, here we see we go 25 miles north. So with displacement, we want to include a direction. So Milwaukee to Port Washington is 25 miles north. Port Washington to Green Bay is another 75 miles north. So all told, we have gone 100 miles north. You can see there's two ways to write that. You can just write the word north afterwards, or if you want to put a positive sign in front of it to denote that you mean up 100 miles or north 100 miles, that also works. If we look at the second example, we can go from Green Bay down to Port Washington and then Port Washington to Milwaukee. Here, the first leg of our trip is 75 miles. Second half is 25 miles for a total of 100 miles of distance traveled. Whereas with displacement, we go 75 miles south and then another 25 miles south for a total of 100 miles south. We can write it just the word south afterwards or put negative 100 miles here. And now this last example, this is where we can start to see a difference between distance and displacement. If we go from Green Bay to Milwaukee, and then from Milwaukee to Port Washington, here's what that looks like. Green Bay to Milwaukee is just 100 miles. And then if we go from Milwaukee back to Port Washington, that's another 25 miles. So the total distance that we've traveled is just 125 miles. Whereas remembering the definition of displacement, that's change in position. So we go 100 miles south, and then we go 25 miles north. Notice that it's positive in our equation here. So our change in position, we have only moved 75 miles south of where we started.